I'm not, in fact, a historian, an economic historian of slavery or the slave trade. So I should probably start by explaining why I got interested in this and how it fits into sort of a larger project I've been working on for some time. This larger project is titled Diversity and the European Expansion in the Early Modern Period. And it is a project in which it's a monograph in which I'm trying to show how the story of the Atlantic expansion, of the phenomenal Atlantic expansion of the early modern period, has in general been written as a story of competition between European empires, competition between proto-nation states in the Atlantic. I am arguing in this monograph that, in fact, that's misleading, that far too little attention has been given to the role of cooperation and emulation, or call it imitation, in the Atlantic. And I want to show how that really was one of the reasons why it was so dynamic. The book has 5 chapters. And you can see them here on the right-hand side, with the usual introduction of explaining why I actually think competition is less important than it's been made out to be. The second chapter is on commercial regulation in the Spanish and English Atlantic. If anyone is interested, this I presented a couple of months ago to the Economic History Association of Israel. It's somewhere on YouTube, as these things go these days. Then there's a chapter on taxes, then another one on debts and finance. And this is what I'm going to present to you today is supposed to become the 5th chapter, namely one on the trade in enslaved people as a pan-European project, or on the Trata. Now, it's always good to start a little bit by putting this into some kind of quantitative context. And what you have here is, from the Transatlantic Slave Database, obviously, the total numbers of enslaved Africans who disembarked in Spanish America over the period of the slave trade. I'm sure almost everybody is familiar with the second peak, the peak on the right-hand side, from the late 18th century to the mid-19th century. And that's, of course, the expansion of the plantation economy in the Spanish Caribbean, but also in some of the very dynamic regions around the Atlantic in the late 18th century. So whether that is the Rio de la Plata or Colombia, Venezuela, etc. So that story is reasonably well known. I think what is less well known is the first peak, the peak that you see from the late 16th century to the mid 17th century, which is quantitatively incredibly large already at this very early stage. So the first point I want to stress here today is that we need to be aware that the creation of the transatlantic slave trade as a mass market transatlantic slave trade is happening in Spanish America in the late 16th and early 17th century. It's not a story about British America or French America or Portuguese America. It's a story about Spanish America in the late 16th and early 17th century. If you want to understand the mass market in enslaved people, this is where we have to look for it. Why hasn't it attracted more attention? It's not a new thing that I say this, but I would argue, has not attracted the attention that it should have attracted. That's in part, of course, because we all know this. Here I chart the introductions of enslaved Africans to Spanish America versus those to Brazil. And of course, from the second half of the 18th century, well, early 18th century onwards, Brazil becomes so large, the trade to Brazil becomes so large that it dwarfs everything else, right? So in a way, it's been sort of lost a little bit in that number. But I think here you have another way of thinking about it. This is the total numbers. So we know it's about 12 million people of the total of the imports of enslaved human capital to the Americas, financed by Europeans from Africa. And what you see here is, I think very importantly, that 2/3 of the enslaved people go to Latin America. If you look at the economic history literature on slavery or on the slave trade, you would be forgiven to think that the British Caribbean or the French Caribbean, or for that matter, the American South, is so much more important, but it isn't. Quantitatively, this is a Latin American story first and foremost, and it strikes me that we haven't actually understood this story well enough. Okay, so what then needs explaining? Well, one way, and the way I think it's often being portrayed, is there's really not much that needs explaining. It's quite obvious that the demographic catastrophe of the indigenous population in the 16th and 17th century leaves the Americas with enormous labor demand. This is a land-rich, labor-scarce society. And when you put that together with the legal prohibition of indigenous slavery in Spanish America, though not in Portuguese America until much later, and you put it together with an Iberian legal heritage, indeed a Mediterranean legal heritage that had legal codes for the creation of slavery, and you add to the equation the fact that supposedly the Europeans are all in competition for the Atlantic market, that they're all vying for advantage in the Atlantic market, then possibly you could say, well, African slavery in Spanish America, there is not much that you need to explain. It is a logical outcome of this set of factors. I don't actually believe that. I think there's an awful lot, if not everything, that we need to explain. The first thing is the two-peak chronology. How do we actually explain that? How do we not only explain the first enormous rise of the trade in enslaved people, but then also the trough? Now, in the conventional story, that's explained away by inter-European competition. Spain loses out against everybody else and therefore has a big disadvantage because there is a much lower number of African enslaved people being imported. And then in the late 18th century, it comes back on the scene. Maybe, but that doesn't explain to us how the actual contractual forms were created in the Spanish Atlantic that were capable of creating this first large peak, very large by the standards of the late 16th and early 17th century. It also tells us nothing about the intense inter-imperial collaboration in this sector. This is a sector, as you will see in a minute, that could not have existed or come into existence without inter-imperial collaboration. And last but not least, something I will not talk about today, but which I think we also still haven't really understood, explained, is the late arrival of plantation, of massive scales of plantation slavery in Spanish America. So if we look at that, I think we probably get closer to this story that I want to convince you of, namely the pan-European roots of African slavery in Spanish America. Now, why pan-European? This is not very elegant, I must admit, in terms of the way in which it is presented, but it's the best I have been able to come up with so far. These are the contracts that I want to focus on, the contracts that underpin the trade in enslaved people organized by Europeans from Africa to Spanish America over the period of the classic transatlantic slave trade. And what you have here is I hope by now most of these contracts. I am painfully aware that there are still contracts I have not discovered. I also must say from the start that contracts that were signed between the monarchy and individual providers or companies for the provision of enslaved Africans to America, but that were not executed, are not in the list. These are only the ones that I know have actually being put into practice. So you have the dates, you have the holders, then you have the regional origin of these holders, you have the type of contract on the right-hand side, you have what we know about the number of enslaved Africans that the contract holders had committed to taking, either the total number or the number per annum, to the extent that I know them. What it will be very clear to you, I want to raise your attention to is the column on the regional origin of the contract holders. These are all different contracts, I repeat, between private or companies, private people or companies with the monarchy for the provision of enslaved Africans to America. And what you basically see there is all of Western Europe. You have actors from Flanders and Germany, Portugal, Italians, Spaniards. Almost everybody is in there. Everybody has their fingers in the pie. It is also, when you look at it through the centuries, a who is who of who has in Europe commercial and legal expertise in creating the kinds of contracts that are needed for these large-scale businesses. So what I want to do with the rest of my time, the 15 minutes, is talk you through phases of the contractual development of this so-called asiento, as it is often referred to, that basically structured the trade in enslaved Africans. In the first phase, what is being done is that the monarchy gives away licenses as merced, as in a way in recognition of services already lent to the government, or as a security in contracts that are fundamentally debt contracts with investors in the monarchy. And what do they do with that? Well, what the crown does by doing this is, on the one hand, it automatically codifies its own right to the proceeds from the taxation of the trade. It does not itself establish a monopoly on the trade, which is unlike what happens in part in Portugal. But it actually treats this like many of these other trades. Mining is another case that comes to mind, where the monarchy basically for itself reserves the right to license it and therefore to receive taxes from this trade. And from the very beginning, it also establishes the nexus, the link between a network of actors who are in public finance and in the administration of this trade. The initiative for these contracts in the 16th century comes overwhelmingly from these private investors. And already they start using a contract that exists before, but that is known as the asiento. Many of you will know what that is. And that becomes almost synonymous with the trata in following centuries. Indeed, in the very late 16th and then first half of the 17th century, during the Union of Crown with Portugal, most of the investors are Portuguese, and they perfect the use of this existing asiento contract, which is fundamentally a succession of rights by the Crown to an individual, to a private actor, to provide a service or to outsource a particular activity. So this is being previously used in public finance. It's being used in order to supply the garrisons in North Africa. It's a very classic contractual form that is being used by the Crown to outsource, if you want, some of its activities. And this license is now, this kind of contract form is adapted perfectly to the slave trade. The asientos are being auctioned off. There's competitive bidding, so the Crown tries to increase its revenue from this trade. The holders are allowed to establish their own agent networks, and these agents have sovereign rights, and that makes it very tricky. Just like tax farmers would, they have the right to establish certain activities in a port, for example, in Cartagena de Indias or in Havana or wherever it is. Now, it's clear that the Crown tries to not make this a monopoly. It tries to hold back licenses for itself, and it also tries to create a supervisory function for the consejos and the Casa de Contratación, because it is worried about a de facto monopoly being established, and it holds for itself these small bits of the market in order to steer the market in a direction where it wants to go. And the reason why it is so worried is because the Portuguese investors in this market managed for a time to integrate the asiento for the supply of enslaved Africans to Spanish America with a Portuguese contrato that gives them a real monopoly on the activity in the conquest of Angola, which is basically where, of course, they take most of these slaves from. And I would argue that this first peak that you saw in the data is fundamentally the result of the combination of a Portuguese and a Spanish contract form, whereby the Portuguese is a full monopoly, the Spanish is not. But this is really where the slave trade becomes the mass slave trade that we refer to today when we talk about the Atlantic slave trade. In the third phase, after the dissolution of the Union of Crowns, the monarchy is in trouble. It loses the Portuguese investors. It loses also the full exclusivity, or rather it creates full exclusivity to the contract holder. The monarchy loses its regulatory tools. The suppliers now are mostly Dutch or Italian, Italians using the Dutch. And what they do is they combine the contract for the provision of enslaved people with other forms, again, with other forms of business. In the case of the Genoese, it's the business in transfer of money from the Americas to Europe, and it is also shipbuilding. The crown basically tasks the Genoese with with building ships for their fleets, for their defense purposes in America. It has also been claimed by others that this is the moment when the enslaved people become fully commodified. What do I mean by that? Well, there is the unit of a slave, which is established as a healthy male, young male, and that is the so-called pieza de India. And what starts appearing in these contracts are fractions of piezas de India. In other words, the people become fractions. But what is important to keep in mind in this phase is that basically the integration of the slave trade with other kinds of transatlantic businesses remains intact, and it's a fairly complex network of trade. In the fourth phase, we are now in the late 17th century, you get intra and inter-imperial asientos, so-called asientos. There's Spanish actors, Dutch actors, English, French, everybody is somewhere in there with restricted licenses. Theoretically, there is an attempt to restrict the licenses to the vassals of the King of Spain, whatever that means. The Genoese, for example, can sort of claim that they are part of that. And almost all the contracts have a link between the slave trade and either finance or naval businesses or other kinds of contracts. But because much of the supply is now linked to supplies indirectly via the Dutch Caribbean, what you end up having is a lot of people who seem to be strawmen for the Dutch West Indies Company. That's actually a very interesting development, because the Dutch West Indies Company in its own right is a company. Not only is it joint stock, but it's a company that has sovereign rights from the Dutch state. So what you get is a kind of undercover legal arrangement where a corporation that has sovereignty from another polity is being given sovereign rights within the Spanish Empire to organize the slave trade. And that turns out to be a mess. It's in fact, when the famous French and English asientos arrive in the early 18th century, where this becomes formalized. So now it's openly an agreement. It's a very strange legal form. It's an agreement between a French or English company, the French Guinea Company, the English South Sea Company, that has sovereign rights from its own polity and is being given sovereign rights in another polity, the Spanish Empire. That is legally an enormously complex arrangement. But the link between public finance and financial markets continues, only now it's being transformed through this shareholding structure officially. And the monarchy becomes in a way, becomes a shareholder of this. So instead of getting taxes, the monarchy now gets a share of the proceeds in this. In some ways, one could think about this as a very innovative legal arrangement. So if you want, you could say you're moving from a public-private partnership to public-public partnership, which is a very peculiar animal legally, and it's heavily resisted in Spanish America. Which brings me to the last phase. And the last phase, fundamentally, after the complete failure of the French and the English asientos, basically failure in both ways. The companies fail, so the French company goes bust, and everybody knows about the South Sea Company going basically bust too. But it's also failure in terms of they don't manage to take a lot of enslaved Africans to Spanish America. So in the last phase that you have here, you have fundamentally going back to competitive sale of licenses to sometimes joint stock companies, sometimes private companies, sometimes they're Spanish, sometimes they're not Spanish. But none of them has sovereign rights in their country of origin. And it seems that that is the one thing that really they couldn't make work in the contractual structure. So you have all the important, interestingly, joint stock companies of the late 18th century, the Guipuzcoana, the Compañía de La Habana. In this, of course, the Gaditana de Negros is only created in order to participate in this trade. But you also have investors who are not organized in joint stock. It seems that joint stock or not doesn't really make much of a difference, nor does the nationality. But what does make a difference is the absence of the sovereign rights from another country. So what's being done here then is they take what I call the public-public partnership back to a public-private partnership. And in the process, it's complicated in different regions, also often managed to sort of reestablish a lot of support from Spanish American elites for this trade. So what I've been trying to trace by talking you through these phases, and of course, it's a complex number of treaties, is to show you how the trata, as we know it, in fact is a result of a combination of an assemblage almost of legal, financial, contractual elements from all over Europe and of capital from all over Europe, right? So it is established by the Castilian monarchs, which claim the right to the exploitation of this, just as they claim the right to the exploitation of mining and other resources in the Americas. But just as they do in most of these other areas, they give up the profit from direct trade or from the financial amounts that could be used in this in return for fiscal streams of income, and also in the beginning for what I call elite allegiance, by giving away these licenses to people who have claimed that they gave already services to the crown. And they do so by using Flemish, German, and Genoese capital from the very beginning. This is from the very beginning a pan-European exercise. Over the first century of the Trata, the existing Castilian contractual arrangement of the asiento, which is used for all matter of contract that involves the monarchy and private investors, is adapted to the trata. And of course, it eventually becomes almost synonymous in the mind of many people with the trata. So what this fundamentally is it organizes slaves, organizes the trade in enslaved people in a way that is like tax farming through licenses. It creates a hierarchy of treaty holders. So the asentista can then sell individual licenses. And the result of that is sort of a layered structure in which the crown receives taxes. The asentista is in fact only a sort of first level of the contract, and then sells often licenses to individual people. It's the addition to the structure of a Portuguese contractual structure, the contratos, which were used in the conquest of Angola, and which also the Portuguese crown used for other forms of the expansion, and which held much stronger monopoly rights, that really creates the initial upsurge, this first large peak in the transatlantic. It is that combination that basically creates what I think today we think about as the transatlantic slave trade. Another contractual element that is well known in the Spanish context is being added to it, and that are these local estancos, where networks of agents are being given the right to control the local market. You throw in the Genoese financial and shipbuilding acumen and their accounting, if you want, acumen that leads to fracturing of the enslaved, and the need to expand the fleet in America, and you get another impetus to the expansion of the trade. The next step, or one parallel step, is the creation of a legal framework for contracting with foreign entities that have sovereign rights. This is initially done with the Dutch, but in the case of the Dutch, they still use fundamentally subterfuge. In other words, they still hide it. They pretend that there is an individual with whom they're contracting, and that the individual is simply standing for the West India Company is conveniently omitted from the documents. It's only when they go to the French that this becomes the official, that is actually in the treaty. And the treaty with the French is interesting because it's completely the same as all the other treaties, with the one difference that the French now are basically a company that has its own sovereign rights, and that doesn't work. The French company goes bust. So does the English company who takes it over. And eventually they go back to what I've called competitive bidding between various private companies, some of which seem to be joint stock, some of which are private, some of them Spanish, some of them international. None of that seems to be making much of a difference. They simply use all the elements of regulation and contract that have developed over the past previous 250 years and create these contracts. So in the end, what I want to argue is, and what I hope I have shown, is that we can only think about the creation of the transatlantic slave trade as really a pan-European in terms of the regulatory forms that are being used and the financial and otherwise knowledge that goes into it. It's part of a set of legal and commercial norms and practices that were used, that were known, and that were then adjusted to the particular circumstances of the trata. And I think what is interesting when you look at the contractual structure here is that what is being stressed often in the literature, the labor demand in America, is very often an afterthought in these contracts. The contracts are much more about the fiscal income, but also about the other commercial and sometimes manufacturing interests of the investors. So the slave trade, in a way, is simply often a means of being able to do other businesses, of doing giro activities, so financial activities in the Americas, of being able to finance shipbuilding, of being able to finance all sorts of other activities. So if we want to understand the, I think the origins of the mass slave trade in the Spanish Atlantic, and that's where the origins are, in my view, then the way to understand this is actually a pan-European collaboration, which in the end facilitated the forcible removal of probably about 2 million Africans to Spanish America. And that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Regina. This has been a really interesting presentation. So now we have time for questions. Everybody can speak. So we are going to get the questions with the microphone. I would only ask you that want to ask questions either to raise your hands or to indicate that you want to ask your questions in the Q&A chat. Okay. So I don't know if anyone want to start.
Yeah. I already raised my hand.
Ah, okay. Jose?
Yes. Hi, thank you very much, Regina. It was a really interesting presentation, but it was not clear to me what were the drivers of this cooperation, because to me it was, I was not able to think about what could force all these empires to cooperate in this way. And the second part of my question, which is related to this one, is what were the fiscal implications of this cooperation, and also the relative importance from a fiscal point of view of these contracts, both to the metropole and the colonies.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, this is, I mean, this is, I think, the core of the argument here. No, in a way, you know, why would they cooperate? Well, I of course can turn this around and say, why would they not? I think, why do they cooperate? Because the trade is impossible for anyone on their own. Only through cooperation, this large-scale trade in enslaved people is possible. And so, in some ways, I think we have a peculiar mindset here. The argument in the Spanish American historiography has been for a long time that Spain is disadvantaged because the Spanish, until the very late 18th century, don't have direct access to the sources of enslaved people, that is, to the African coast. And that puts them on the back foot, and that means that they basically that they are at the mercy of these other Europeans, be it the Portuguese or the Dutch or the English or the French. But in a way, that's a strange way of thinking about a market, right? It never stopped, you know, the other Europeans from making profits in the trade, say in silver with Asia, that the silver itself, that they could not control the production of the silver itself, right? So there's a very strange idea where out of the sudden it's argued that if you cannot control, let's call this market from the production, that is from the enslavement of people to the final destination, then somehow you are at a disadvantage. We wouldn't make that argument, I think, in almost any other market. So this is I think what skews the debate. So why cooperation? Because cooperation is basically where the money is, right? So that's my answer for that. What are the fiscal implications? Well, the fiscal implications are therefore shared, right? Now, in fiscal terms, the Spanish Empire doesn't get out of it badly because it realizes relatively substantial income from it, but it's controversial because there's also a sharing of the fiscal dues between, say, are they being paid in Spain or are they being paid in the ports of arrival? And when you look at the contracts, one of the most controversial and clearly one of the areas where the regulation is most detailed, which I think often would indicate that there is most concern, is where exactly are these fees to be paid? Are they being paid directly to the monarchy when the contract is being signed, or are they being paid in port when they arrive? And this is a never-ending discussion where obviously in Cartagena de Indias, the interest is that these fees should be paid locally, while obviously the monarchy wants them to be paid when the contract is actually established, which is then interesting when when say the French and the English companies come in, because at that point, the monarchy really becomes, if you want, a shareholder of the contract, which I think is a very interesting, from a fiscal perspective, a very interesting construction, if that makes sense. I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Regina. We have another question by Esteban Nicolini.
Hola, ¿me escuchan?
Hola, Esteban.
Tanto tiempo, Regina, un gusto.
Sí, un gusto.
Bueno, disfruté muchísimo la presentación, súper interesante. Me quedé como al final con la sensación de que nos presentaste una información cuantitativa, pico extraño, bueno, o relativamente no esperado ahí al comienzo del periodo. Luego todos unos distintos arreglos institucionales que van evolucionando en el tiempo. Y estaba esperando al final que hagas la conexión de por qué estos arreglos institucionales generaron que en un momento haya más y en otro momento menos, y ahí me quedé como faltando. Me gustaría ver si hay alguna hipótesis más precisa acerca de la conexión entre las cantidades comerciadas y si estos arreglos institucionales variantes hicieron que se muevan en una dirección o en otra. Y la segunda pregunta es, en alguna parte, al final me pareció que sugerías que como que la evidencia que presentabas implicaba que no pareciera que la demanda de esclavos hubiera sido importante, sino que más bien la cuestión de eso, de las negociaciones y los arreglos contractuales fueron importantes, o más importantes que la demanda, y tampoco terminé de entender muy claro dónde podíamos confirmar, digamos, los dos puntos, y nada, un gusto.
No, muchísimas gracias. No, sí, eso obviamente es la parte que es más difícil en realidad, digamos, tener pruebas, ¿no? Porque es cierto que tenemos un poco el resumen cuantitativo, sabemos más o menos ahora cuáles son las cantidades en este comercio, en la trata. Sabemos que hay, digamos, estos dos momentos de un auge importantísimo, y después hay una fase en la que la trata es menos importante. Hay que decir que estos datos de la Transatlantic Slave Database, para la fase que son, digamos, donde parece que hay un declive importante de la trata, es la fase donde son menos exactos. ¿Y por qué? Porque en la fase en la que hay más asientos y contratos individuales, y hay un cierto caos, digamos, contractual, hay un auge de un comercio intracolonial entre los imperios, o sea, intracolonial pero interimperial, muy importante, que es muy difícil saber cómo funciona porque va sin registrarse, ¿no? Entonces, digamos, el declive no es tan declive como parece en los datos. ¿Dónde está la relación directa? Yo creo que la relación entre el primer auge, realmente la primera expansión, que es impresionante si pensás en la tecnología que tienen a principios del siglo XVII, este punto de colaboración entre, sobre todo, actores hispanos y portugueses. Este está bastante bien explicado por la combinación de contratos. También la primera caída, al final de la unión de las coronas, o sea, la secesión de Portugal, en gran parte se explica por eso. Siempre pensando a la vez que hay mucho más contrabando en esa época y que por lo tanto no sabemos si podemos fiarnos de sus datos. Y la tercera es realmente sacarse encima el asiento, el intento de hacer un asiento entre corporaciones que tienen derechos soberanos de otro soberano. Esto es la forma contractual que realmente no funciona, ¿no? Eso sería como yo hago en este momento el enlace entre la parte institucional, entre la parte contractual y lo cuantitativo. Después, la otra pregunta, obviamente muy controvertida y muy problemática, es este argumento que realmente, pues la demanda hay, pero así muy a la tradicional, yo estoy básicamente diciendo que lo que importa es la oferta, no es la demanda, es casi 6 logos, ¿no? Donde hay una oferta y una demanda. Y me parece que esto es importante. No quiero decir, obviamente, que la demanda no la hay. Es obvio que es importante en el sentido que la justificación que los inversores utilizan una y otra vez para acercarse a la corona y decir, nosotros queremos hacer un contrato, un asiento para la introducción de esclavos en América. Esto siempre, la justificación es la demanda. Y es claro que hay la demanda. Hay las cartas que llegan de Buenos Aires y de Cartagena de Indias y de La Habana y de todos lados de necesitamos más introducción de esclavos. Lo que estoy diciendo es que esto en sí mismo no explica lo que está pasando, ¿no? Que eso, el argumento que siempre se ha hecho que bueno, es lógico, hay una demanda y por lo tanto eso funciona, se busca su camino, en fin, eso no lo creo que podemos mantener ese argumento. Espero que esto es un poco una respuesta a tu pregunta.
Muchas gracias.
So, thank you very much. Next question by Montserrat Cachero.
Hola, buenas tardes. Hola, Regina.
Buenas.
¿En Spanish o English?
Como quiera.
Bueno, a mí me parece muy interesante, pero claro, también es que yo creo que es un proyecto súper ambicioso, porque es un mundo, ¿no? Esto es un proyecto de vida que te da para una y para 10 vidas más. Entonces, mi pregunta era sobre la diferencia entre la legalidad y la realidad, ¿no? Porque yo los datos que suelo trabajar en las fuentes, porque uso otro tipo de fuentes, no son lo que se le dice a la corona, lo que se firma con la corona, sino lo que realmente se hace, ¿no?
Sí.
Otro tipo de archivos, ¿no?
Sí.
Entonces, bueno, pues era sobre si tenías algunos datos sobre ese mercado secundario donde todas estas licencias y todas estas cuestiones que se regulan por la corona, luego se revenden 19 millones de veces. Sí. Y se va inflando el precio y todos esos mercados secundarios. Y luego tenía un par de comentarios respecto a lo que había dicho Esteban de la demanda. Yo hace algún tiempo encontré muchas alusiones a estas cuestiones en los juicios de residencia, por ejemplo, cuando con la cuestión del asiento de los Belser, ¿no? Hay muchas quejas sobre que los Belser que sí están monopolizando y que no tienen suficientes esclavos y tal. Bueno, pues luego cuando abren el mercado encuentran en los juicios de residencia que te repiten, no, es que con los Belser estábamos mejor, porque ellos garantizaban un mínimo suministro, ¿no? Entonces, quizá eso sea una fuente para contrarrestar o para dar evidencia de esa demanda, aunque en estas cuestiones todo el mundo se queja al final, ¿no? Pero bueno, cuando el río suena, agua lleva. Y por último, respecto a la cooperación, muy brevemente, a mí me da la sensación, también a lo mejor por el tipo de fuentes que yo trabajo, que todas estas diferenciaciones entre ingleses, franceses, la colonia genovesa, son artificiales y las hacemos muchas veces los historiadores a posteriori. Pero en aquel momento no había esos límites, ¿no? Esos boundaries muchas veces existen en la literatura legal de la corona, pero entre la gente no es verdad. O sea, desde el minuto 1, a pesar de las prohibiciones, siempre hay acuerdos comerciales en todos los mercados, no solo en el de esclavos, en cualquier tipo de producto, todo el mundo negocia con todo, es como una feria, ¿no? Entonces, tú dices, ¿dónde está realmente el cumplimiento, el enforcement de esas reglas reales que en el mercado no existen, ¿no? Pues nada más, que enhorabuena, muy interesante.
No, muchísimas gracias. No, obviamente esto es el tema entre la legalidad y la realidad siempre es el proof of the pudding, ¿no? Es un problema que solamente podemos abordar por partes, ¿no? Nunca lo vamos a saber, como ya dije, sobre todo a mediados, por ejemplo, del 17, bueno, lo que son las instrucciones oficiales y lo que son las instrucciones reales, ahí se abre un abismo, ¿no? Pero me parece muy interesante lo que decís sobre los juicios de residencia y ese tipo de quejas, ¿no? Porque como historiadora, como vos sabés muy bien, uno puede irse a esos archivos y podés encontrar argumentos para el argumento que sea, o el argumento que el monopolio es el problema, o el argumento que el monopolio es la solución. Según lo que rige en el momento es el problema, ¿no? Y esto a mí me llama la atención, sobre todo en digamos, en el argumento, pensando el argumento de que la demanda siempre la hubo y la demanda era un pozo sin fondo que se podía introducir tantos esclavizados como uno quería y siempre los vendía. Pues no. El punto es que hasta la expansión de la economía de plantación, no es así. Lo que se ve una y otra vez es cuando hay, digamos, una llegada masiva relativamente para el mercado local de esclavizados, los precios se van para abajo y seriamente. Por lo tanto, yo estoy totalmente de acuerdo con vos, ¿no? O sea, los lugareños siempre se quejan. Y eso es la única constante que tenés ahí en 3 siglos, es que los lugareños se quejan. Y se quejan porque el reglamento dice, obviamente siempre hay los que se benefician y los que pagan la factura. Pero yo creo que, insisto, todo esto a mí me indica que no podemos, por lo menos tenemos como historiadores económicos, que cuestionar seriamente que antes de la transición, digamos, a una economía enfocada en la plantación, que es muy tarde, la demanda realmente era una cosa obvia, porque lo mismo lo ves en los documentos ingleses y en los documentos holandeses, ¿no? Que hay la idea de que, bueno, los españoles son inútiles y si nosotros conseguimos mandar más esclavizados a los puertos en Hispanoamérica, las vamos a vender siempre a un muy buen precio. Y no funciona. Entonces yo simplemente quiero, digamos, poner ahí un poco un reparo, ¿no? Un poco un punto de decir, no, ese argumento de que eso es un labor scarce economy, por lo tanto siempre hay demanda para esclavizados, no funciona, no es automático. Y después, sí, lo de la cooperación, bueno, creo que hemos aprendido un montón en los últimos años sobre estas cooperaciones interimperiales. y estoy seguramente de acuerdo que sobre todo hasta, digamos, mediados del 17, la colaboración entre actores que tal vez nosotros podríamos hoy pensar que son de distintos orígenes, es bastante fluida. Pero hay también puntos donde deja de funcionar. Y por eso yo estuve un poco enfatizando este momento de la transición entre, digamos, funciona todavía cuando uno tiene la West India Company de los holandeses ahí encubierto, ¿no? Detrás de un prestanombre, una persona que básicamente hace de representante. Cuando tenés el contrato directamente, ese contrato muy extraño entre una entidad que tiene derechos soberanos, sea del Estado francés o del Estado británico, y a su vez tiene que tener derechos soberanos del Imperio Español, la cosa realmente, ahí la cosa se hace complicada. Y una de las cosas que es interesante es que a los que menos les gusta la idea del so-called Spanish asiento, o sea, del asiento inglés, son los de Jamaica. Porque Jamaica tenía un contrabando importantísimo con los territorios españoles, y cuando hay una compañía monopolística inglesa, se acaba la fiesta, ¿no? Entonces, los que realmente están en contra de eso son los jamaicanos. Así que hay los límites, ¿no? Eso creo que hay que tomar en cuenta. Muchas gracias.
Thanks. I think we have another 2 questions, one by Hoyt Blickley and the other one by Stefano. So, Hoyt, please.
There we go. Hi, thanks.
I think you are muted. Hoyt?
Well, in any case, not.
You are muted. We cannot hear you. No. Maybe you have problems with the microphone.
Maybe you want to write in the chat.
Yeah.
I can read it to everybody.
So yeah. So maybe we can go to Stefano's question, and Hoyt, maybe in the meantime, you can sort out your problems with the microphone or write your question in the chat. Stefano?
Yeah, it's a very simple question. In this complex web of contracts between different polities, who would be in charge of implementing the property rights if there is a conflict? It is obvious for anybody to have sufficient incentive to enter into this contractual relationship. There must be sufficiently sure that in case of conflict, there is someone who is going to take a decision and settle the conflict. So who would be in charge of this?
Well, more often than not, the first set of decisions is, it won't surprise you, local institutions, right? It is, of course, well known that local legal and regulatory institutions have quite a lot of leeway in Spanish America, and they use it in this case. Now, that doesn't mean that that is the last word, because quite often, especially in these cases, they appeal, and they eventually appeal to the Consejo de Indias, or they appeal all the way up to the Crown. And things are being reversed back and forth. But as you very well point out, I mean, one of the reasons why it is so hard for the French and for the English company, for the South Sea Company, to make this work is because the local institutions basically boycott them left, right, and center, right? And this is something they have a very hard time countering. Yes, you know, eventually 10 years later, they might actually get some redress if that is what is decided from the Crown. But that's a very difficult path to take. And so I think there is an interesting story, which I haven't worked on, but which would be, I think, fascinating, is to see to what extent, it's clear that the English factors on the ground cannot understand or find it hard to understand why they can't make what they think are their rights stick. Right? They're having a very different idea of what the rights they were given and how they would be imposed. And I think there is an interesting case that one could look at to actually disentangle to what extent these expectations with which French and English factors come in, not so much the Dutch, because they're never the official factors, right? But the English and the French are the official factors. And it's clear from the little I have seen of those individuals that they basically can't understand why the local institutions just do what they want, right? Which, most economic historians of Latin America are not very surprised by, but apparently it came as news to the English factors.
Yeah.
Okay. We may take a few more minutes beyond the hour. So Hoyt, please.
Yeah, sorry about the muting issue. Nice to see you. A very interesting talk, Regina. My question, I guess, is related to Douglas North in some sense, right? Which is, your talk is very much on the most well-known part of Douglas North, that is to say, the institutional mechanisms that govern trade. But the lesser well-known part of Douglas North is the change in productivity of the shipping industry. From 1600 to whenever he ended, 1900, let's say. And he finds some pretty significant technological differences that he credits in part to TFP and so forth. Anyway, that seems like that could factor into your analysis, in the sense that it's you sort of discard the importance of labor demand, but it seems like technology is potentially an important driver of technical change, or at least it's sort of a nuisance, I think, for your argument.
Yeah, okay, no, that's great. So let me just restate, I'm not totally discarding demand. What I'm saying is we can't just take demand for granted, right? Which is what most people have done. So the productivity in shipping is interesting. And of course, we know that in the trade and enslaved people, there are, in fact, great improvements in the productivity in shipping. In a way, it's however exogenous to my argument, because of course the shipping is always done by non-Spanish, until the very late 18th century. It's always done by non-Spanish shipping, right? The shipping is done by Portuguese or by Dutch or French or English. So whatever the productivity gains in shipping, in transatlantic shipping, and more specifically in the transport of enslaved Africans are actually these benefits are included in a way in anything that happens to the introduction of enslaved Africans into Spanish America anyway, because the shipping ain't Spanish, right? So in a way, it's interesting. It's an interesting case, because whatever productivity gains there would have benefited Spanish America in the same way as it benefited everybody else, if that makes sense.
Okay, so thanks very much, everybody. Thank you very much for this path-breaking presentation. Very interesting discussion. Thank you all for coming here. We had an excellent turnout, so we are very happy that this was such a successful opening of the webinar this term. I have 3 announcements before the end. First, reminding you that this is a joint initiative by el Colegio de México, Universidad de la República, Universidad Carlos III, and Universidad de Barcelona. And these webinars will be available in YouTube, okay? And also remind you that the next webinar will be on the 12th of March, so 2 Fridays from today, by Pablo Astorga. We'll move to the 20th century with a paper on new evidence on income inequality and concentration in Latin America, 1920-2011. So I think this is all. I would like to thank Regina again for being here.
Muchísimas gracias a todos. Muchísimas gracias por su atención y también por las preguntas. Esto seguramente todavía es work in progress, pero bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias por nuestra parte. Muchas gracias a todos los que habéis venido y nos vemos en 2 semanas. Gracias a todos. Chao.
Chao.